So waving gestures and our surfing them. I must admit that I'm a bit nervous about giving this talk, especially in front of so many brilliant scholars, because it is the first time. I mean, I've been thinking about this topic quite a lot and about waves in general, and I used to be a surfer actually, and trying to relate this to concepts of gesture. And I feel like all the ideas are there in my head, but when you come to try and write them down or put them into a slideshow, it gets a bit tricky. So I hope this is going to make some sense. A little bit of background is that I'm writing a book called The Body Language Myth, Understanding Gesture in Language and Communication. It was originally going to be quite a simple book. It was going to kind of oppose the sort of mainstream idea of body language that we hear about in the media nearly every day about such and such a politician's gestures giving off such and such a meaning. And then to kind of show that in contrast with the concepts that are being developed in gesture studies from psycholinguistic or cognitive semiotic or multimodal interactive perspectives. So then I realized actually that there is a lot of work that embraces the body language concept, and that I couldn't just reject it because there are many strands of empirical work and theoretical work and different lines of thinking that embrace that concept. So actually it became an exercise of mapping out, first of all the different kinds of approaches to gesture. And I realized that many of them, one way to think about that landscape is to think of them as ways of relating bodies and language. And many of the terms that we use to describe bodies and language are kind of integrative concepts like body language, as I mentioned, but also embodied language and linguistic bodies and languaging bodies and in-language bodies. They all bring bodies and language into relation in one particular way or in different ways. So the idea was, well, what do those, as integrative concepts, what areas of the body language relations do they highlight or do they foreground? Which ones are backgrounded? Which approaches deal with which kind of materials well, and so on. And then in doing that exercise, then I came up with the idea that any gesture emerges from these different relations. So gestures are like relations, and there's all this research showing that gesture is kind of embedded in or materializes from these different relations between bodies and language, and the environment's often in there as well. So in doing that, I came to kind of, I was introduced to a broader range of reading that took me into cultural anthropology and dance studies, and as I'll mention a bit later, surf studies and different fields that I hadn't originally linked with gesture studies that are looking at body language relations as well. And they kind of allow me to look back on some of those concepts that are quite central to more mainstream approaches in gesture studies, like embodiment, gesture units, interaction, mundane activity, and to also question those as well. And it's within that context that I thought that waves and waving is actually quite an interesting dynamic or gesture or natural phenomena that helps us to think about these relations between bodies and language and about the different approaches to gesture study that we find as well. Okay, so with that said, give me a second. I'm just letting a few people in the room here. I see that I've let in David Fleming. You have to be careful with him because a discussion with him can just turn your intellectual world on its head, inside out, back to front. So he's in the room. Watch out, everybody. Let's begin with some waves that you might be familiar with. This is what I call the wave that got CityU, my university. This was Hong Kong's 5th wave of the coronavirus pandemic. Semester B last year, when we went to 5 or 6 cases a day, up to 70 or 80,000 a day in the space of a few weeks. I'll never forget the first time I saw a positive COVID test. It was on the table. It was on a desk in the library next to some half-finished homework. A few days later, all teaching and learning activities went back online. The halls of residence were evacuated as COVID as this wave of COVID surged through the campus and through the wider city. When I came here in 2018, looking back, I think Hong Kong was in some sense ready for the pandemic, because I remember already seeing people opening doors with their feet or using a tissue to protect their skin from contact with other people or with doorknobs. And I remember thinking that was a bit strange, but when COVID arrived, this way of relating with the world suddenly made sense. So what COVID forced me to remember from primary school, actually, is that our relatedness with our environment is not only perceptual, cognitive, physical, and cultural, as I'd learned from cognitive linguistics, but also biological. Many of us, sadly, waved goodbye to loved ones during the pandemic and might be familiar with the dynamics of a waving gesture. We wave goodbye either when separated because of restrictions on travel, or sadly at funerals. This picture here is taken at Fleetwood Docks, a fishing town in Lancashire, just up the road from where I grew up. I'd always imagined that this statue on the docks captured or embodied a scene of a family waving farewell to their fisherman father. But one of the old guys at Fleetwood Museum told me that it showed a woman and children waving to welcome their menfolk back from long periods at sea, as it was considered bad luck to wave them goodbye on the outward journey. So it makes me think of the archive footage of everybody waving off the Titanic. If only they'd known. My dad often goes to visit the statue, which he described to me recently as movingly beautiful, although the statue itself doesn't move, or at least not much. But we can see how these things in our environment also affect our bodies as well. And probably if you looked at that statue for long enough or close enough, you would see that it is actually moving. De Paulo, Cafari, and De Jager write in Linguistic Bodies that bodies have more in common with hurricanes than statues. And they mean a few things like by this, some of which are borne out in the following video. So this video was shared by the Daily Mail, and it was taken at a fishing port in Cornwall and shows a young girl called Tony Rose running down a quay to welcome her fishing skipper father home from sea. As she sees her father's boat arrive, the youngster begins frantically waving and calling daddy. She runs down the quay towards her father with open arms and yelling, "I love you." Her father disembarks and runs to meet his waiting daughter before picking her up in embrace. All of this creating what the newspaper refers to as an adorable moment. Yeah, if you want to make some extra cash, by the way, just send some videos to the Daily Mail. But I'm interested in the dynamics of these, what we call adorable moments. And there's quite a range of these kind of videos or media that kind of have these heartwarming or adorable scenes. And this one particularly is interesting to compare with that scene at the statue. So to get from the movingly beautiful statue to the movement of the adorable moment, we do not add agency to the statue and see how it interacts. Rather, we must unravel the embodiment of the statue. For if we try to represent this scene of the father and daughter coming together and the waving gestures, we might end up with something looking and feeling quite different to the statue on Fleetwood Docks. And this brings me to an idea from Tim Ingold, which is a distinction he introduces between interaction and correspondence. Interaction is one of the most widely used terms, I think, in the area, in at least some areas of gesture studies. And Tim Ingold has a critique of interaction in suggesting that it's quite a static concept that pits people against each other face to face. Whereas what we do in social encounters is often go along with each other. And rather than taking turns and going back and forth, we intertwine with each other and become entangled. And I think that in unraveling the statue on Fleetwood Docks into the adorable moment that we see between a daughter and fisherman father, we see a form of correspondence rather than a form of interaction. Okay, but we also have waving off gestures, like actual gestures we refer to. So there's waving goodbye, there's waving hello, and then we can wave off a fight. In boxing matches or MMA, you'll often hear that the referee steps in to wave off the fight. This was referee Mike Griffin stepping in to stop Anthony Joshua in his first Andy Ruiz Jr. fight. And then on the right here, I've got a short video of Peter Hickmott, a referee, putting a stop to the bout between Charles Jourdain and Doohoo Choi. And what you can see here is from this entanglement of half-naked, bloody, sweaty, tired bodies, you see the materialization of a really nice waving gesture by the referee. Have a look at this. I think you've seen that one now. So what I like about this one is the way that this waving gesture kind of feeds off, but also feeds into the dynamics of the situation that is unraveling there. And it's actually, it literally possibly saves the life of this MMA fighter, Doohoo Choi, because he's stepping in there to prevent further damage. And in his semi-conscious state, a few more beatings might have led to some permanent damage. So the waving off gesture actually looks and feels similar to a kind of everyday gesture, but it can be, it can have serious implications for life. So I want to bring life into the picture of these waving gestures. But some of you will also recognize that this waving gesture looks like a gesture of negation that we find in spoken language, which brings me to the book I wrote about gesture and negation called The Impulse to Gesture. And I called this waving gesture here, like that, a vertical palm oscillate gesture. I just told my friend here on the screen that I was once robbed at knife point in the city where we lived, Bordeaux. And he said, yeah, you might get some gentle harassment. Then interrupted himself to say, sorry, what you had wasn't gentle harassment, it was awful. And as he says, sorry, what you had wasn't gentle harassment, he's waving his hands like this. It's an example of the tight bonding between language and gesture at grammatical and pragmatic levels, specifically between the speech act of apology or metalinguistic negation and the waving gesture. But when I published that book in 2018, I hadn't yet made the connection between oscillation and waves, let alone realized its potential significance for understanding gesture in language and communication, or the relation between bodies and language. I did mention waves once in that 2008 book. In fact, it was where I got the idea for this impulse to gesture. One second. The idea of an impulse to gesture was originally inspired by viewing waveforms created by a motion capture system that was computing the size, speed, shape of a person's hand movements in real time as she gestured. The physics definition of an impulse is a force acting briefly on a body and producing a finite change of momentum. This is borne out by the motion capture screenshot. A person's body is acted on by some force, and the produced change of momentum results in the gesture we might recognize. She's actually doing this. I would go on to illustrate in the book how during spoken language conversations, one thing shaping, determining, and organizing this impulse to gesture is negation, the focus of the book, which results in these recurrent bindings between language and gesture, like waving off with apologies. In terms of the actual wave on the screen here, it's measuring the magnitude of movement of reflective markers that are placed on the person's hand. So if you look closely at that wave there, the sharp increase in magnitude is the person preparing to gesture. Those peaks that you can see in the middle there are the hands moving up and down, which was the gesture stroke. And then the slope off is the hands returning to rest by the sides of the speaker. So of course, this movement excursion is what Adam Kendon referred to as the gesture unit. So Adam Kendon introduced the gesture unit as the entire movement excursion, which commences the moment the gesturing limb or limbs begin to leave their position of rest or relaxation, and which finishes only when the limbs are once again relaxed. Okay, so that's why the word unit appears over 100 times in my gesture book, whereas the word wave only appears once. So I'd now like to turn to a fascinating book about gesture, where not only do units not play a role, but the very idea of dividing bodily movements into beginnings and endings like this is fiercely challenged and rejected. I'm talking about The Primacy of Movement by dance philosopher Maxine Sheaves Johnson. It shouldn't, but it does take a dancer and philosopher to tell neuroscientists, and I'd say gesture researchers, what they ought to know about, but have consistently ignored. Reads one testimonial on the back cover of this mammoth philosophical discourse on animate forms of life, consciousness, kinesthesia, and the conceptual significance of movement. What dancing teaches us, and ought not to be ignored by people researching relations between bodies, minds, and language, is that thinking in movement, to quote Sheaves Johnson, involves no symbolic counters, but is tied to an ongoing qualitatively experienced dynamic in which movement possibilities arise and dissolve. So there are just two things there. One is that this idea of symbolic counters is actually central to cognitive linguistics, which is the approach that my Impulse to Gesture book was grounded in, and which is quite central, has been quite a central approach to the development of cognitive linguistics. We talk a lot, in gesture studies, we talk a lot in cognitive linguistics about units and unit status, and that is actually a defining property of language and linguistic structures. And to argue that gestures are part of language, we've tried to show that gestures do have this unit status, and they do bring into relation a phonological structure, in this case bodily, with a semantic one, meaning. But in Sheaves Johnson's perspective from improvisational dance, there are no symbolic counters in thinking in movement. So that's an interesting thing. The other one is that I like this notion of movement possibilities arising and dissolving, which is very wave-like, as we'll see a little bit later. Unfortunately for this presentation, Sheaves Johnstone illustrates what she means here by narrating her phenomenological experience of waving in the swirl of improvisational dance. I'm sorry, I've got a bit of a long quote here, but I want to read it out. This is Maxine Sheaves Johnson's descriptive account, phenomenological, experiential, descriptive account of the appearance of a waving gesture within the swirl of improvisational dance. So you can read it for yourself, but I'm also going to read it out to help. So the movement that I actually create at any moment is not a thing that I do, an action that I take, or behavior in which I engage, but a passing moment within a dynamic process, a process that I cannot divide into beginnings and endings. There is a dissolution of my passing movements into my perpetually moving present, and a dilation of my perpetually moving present into my continuing movements. The sequential waving gesture I'm now making with my arm, for example, is spilling over into a turning movement I'm now making with my head. And the turning movement I'm now making with my head is spilling over into a bending of my torso and a sideward leaping in the direction opposite to that of my turning head. We really need a dancer to be visualizing this for us as well. It would be great. I have indeed made each of these movements. I have moved my way into them in the course of improvising, yet they are not detachable moments. They have no separate or separable existence for me, even with a sequential waving gesture I am now making with my arm to dissolve into stillness or end abruptly. I could not say when the gesture ended and when the stillness began, or that the stillness was not an ongoing creation of the dance. My thinking in movement is not an assemblage of discrete gestures happening one after the next, which is exactly how I treated gestures in the Impulse to Gesture book, but an unfolding of all movement into a perpetually moving present. thinking in movement is an experience in which the qualitative dynamics of movement combine to form an ongoing kinetic happening. Sorry for that long quote, but I think it's worth it because it highlights a few points there underlined that I'm going to come back to as we go on through the talk. What I'll just draw attention to at this point is this idea of gesture or the waving as being a passing moment within a dynamic process. Whereas if we just think back to Kendon's definition of gesture and identification of the gesture unit as a dynamic moment that arises from a rest, it's like the exact opposite, or I feel that there's a lot of tension between those two ways of looking at gesture. So one thing that I'm trying to do is think about how to reconcile them. And I think that the waving gesture kind of really helps to think about that or to do that. Of course, there are many gesture researchers who have thought about dance before, and there are many dancers who have thought about gesture, thinking, of course, of Mike O'Connor, who will give a talk with Alan Schenke later on today. But Rudolf Laban and dance theorists, Mary Wigan, they conceptualize dance as gesture. And then there are researchers who conceptualize gesture as dance. For example, in his 2017 book, Self-Making Man, Jürgen Streeck, who was one of the founders of the original International Society for Gesture Studies, writes in his book about dance as not only an analogy for embodied communication, but a paradigmatic case of the integration of modalities that make up embodied communication. This is one of the examples from his book where you have an exchange between a garage owner and a customer on his forecourt, and he analyzes it and says that it's like a sequential movement between tango dancers, except that it's enlanguaged and is also, part of a professional encounter as well. So I think it's interesting that gesture researchers have thought of gesture as dance, not only as analogy, but as paradigmatic case, or what Jürgen Streeck calls a metonymy of embodied communication. So correct me if I'm wrong, philosophers out there, but I think that what I want to say here is that dance and gesturing in conversation in spoken language, the gap between those two is not an ontological or metaphysical gap. It's just a gap of degree. But when we start talking about a gesture unit and even analyzing those, for example, in a software like Elan, and also transcribing them, then we are shifting on the ontological status of what it is that we're trying to study or trying to understand. But still, you might think we've come quite a bit far away from spoken language communication here. So I'm going to try to see if we can, with an example of waving from my own videos that I've collected, see if we can look at that as a kind of form of dance. So let's see if we can tentatively analyze these gestural movements of waving within the unraveling encounter between friends here who are walking out of their foyer of their apartment building in Ningbo, China. This is my wife, Ximbao, in white there, and her friend Lin Jie in lilac on the right. And they're about to part company for after having spent the afternoon together. And you'll see that Lin Jie heads up towards her car in the parking lot, and you might recognize some of these passing moments of movement that we're going to call waving. If you can't speak Chinese, I'm afraid you just have to imagine what they're saying to each other. So as they exit the foyer, Lin Jie is pointing to the location of her car and announcing the direction she's about to be heading in. Her upper bodily orientation, gaze, forearm, and finger are all adjusting to the location of the car, which is relative to their movement. So this is an adaptive process that we're seeing here. It's not a gesture that is kind of detachable, but it's embedded in this dynamically moving situation, and relative to it changes every step she takes. Her friend says, okay, and as the pair's arms begin slipping apart, I don't know if you noticed, but Linjie tenderly guides her friend to one side with the effect of a kind of do-si-do. In the next instant, she's descending her path, looking at me and waving goodbye as a young man talking on his phone strides by. We're all now exchanging glances and laughing as I warn her to watch out for the oncoming car she's not noticed. She's momentarily thrown into a rest, like a kite whose flyers pulled back on the strings. Another allusion to Ingold's work, before laughing and more safely carrying on, spinning around once again to offer a final wave goodbye and smile over her shoulder before peeling off towards a car. I'll show that again.
这样的啊？对，就跟我说这样，所以你看，今天9月2号送来的。哦，对啊，那还挺准时。是，好的，去那边。好了，拜拜，拜拜，再见。
再见，拜拜，小心。
其实你别看他不保养，其实他保养的挺好的。
So I love that moment where she's suddenly stopped by this watch out for the car, and like she literally like spills out into the environment like that and then carries on in her way. So yes, I think just to paraphrase Sheets Johnson, we see a passing moment within a dynamic process, a process we cannot easily divide into beginnings and endings, a dissolution of her passing movements into a perpetually moving present, and a dilation of her perpetually moving present into her continuing movements. Her waving gestures spilling over into a turning movement she's now making with her head, and the turning movement is now spilling over into a bending of her torso. So unlike dancing, the situation that I'm describing here, and see if Silver and others agree with me, is what interactional sociolinguistics or multimodal interaction scholars would call a mundane interaction. This is mundane interaction. To use some descriptors from Goodwin's book, Charles Goodwin, on cooperative action, what we see here is a mundane activity involving mundane conversation and mundane gestures in a mundane setting on the mundane social world. Just Google mundane interaction and you'll come across a whole field of research that distinguishes this kind of interaction from something like surgeon's encounter with a patient or something like that. Now, the meaning of mundane at play here, I think, the one I found in Oxford Languages, is lacking interest or excitement or dull. But from a sense-making perspective, for example, put forth by Paul Thibault, the world that we live in, quote, is a dynamic world of process that is alive and not only not dull, but indeed shimmering with value and value gradients that attract and repel us in innumerable ways when we seek its values and tap into its value gradients. And from this perspective, there's nothing mundane or dull about this occasion of experience, or what De Jager and De Paulo would term a situation of participatory sense-making. So, arising from traditions including phenomenology, philosophical biology, and embodied cognitive science, sense-making theory takes the self-organization of organisms as foundation for human cognition. As we discussed this morning with Eleanor Kafari, sense-making is like the inactive term for cognition. So if you're interested in psycholinguistic approaches to gesture or cognitive science or philosophy of mind, sense-making is kind of a term for cognition that you can look into. At the most basic level, organisms seek to engage flows of matter that sustain their existence while rejecting and avoiding those threatening its self-distinction. A classic example involves bacteria beginning to swim rather than randomly tumble upon encountering a sucrose gradient. For the organism, sense-making transforms the otherwise physico-chemical world into an environment full of significance. So the reason why I'm introducing that here is because these two, the diagram that you can see here for participatory sense making really brings the dynamic environment into the equation between the what we might call social agents, or the sense makers who are involved in some kind of sense making encounter like the one we just saw. And a diagram like this, I think, invites you to, as a starting point, or what we might call like a starting point for analysis, is that we take into account the environmental dynamics, the dynamics of embodiment and the material process of bodies, and how they regulate each other and feed into each other when we are in co-presence, when we are within the context of social encounters within environments. So you can see there's some transitions between some of these ideas that I still need to work out. But to come back to that idea of mundane interaction, the idea of mundane being dull or lack of interesting is actually an extended sense that only dates back to the mid-19th century, before which the word meant of this world, mundane, of this world, from Old French mondain, which you'll recognize if you speak French, much more in line with the sense-making concepts that start from this organism-environment relation when we talk about mundane being from this, or of this world, or from this world. So let's now discuss what it means to be of this world. Another smooth segue there. Okay. British comedian Sean Locke makes a joke about worlds. He says some people see the planet as something they have to be grateful for, thankful for. They should nurture and care for it. And other people see the planet as something you stand on. This gets a laugh from the audience, but if you ask students, or well, I ask my students of language and communication to draw a picture of the world, and they do draw something like it's something that you can stand on. And this idea of a world that you can stand on rather than a world that you are of is a distinction that Tim Ingold has picked up in Being Alive. So when we image the world in this bounded way, says Tim Ingold in Being Alive, we detach ourselves from it in order to look back on the things to be found in it, or to discern their congealed shapes and layouts, which makes me think of some approaches to gesture where we're looking for particular form, meaning, relations, even though we contextualize them within the flow of languaging activity. But I think that world of congealed shapes and layouts is one where we found many of the gestures, postures, tics, and gaits that have been spotted and described in the areas of gesture study. To inhabit the world, on the other hand, is to join with such shapes, layouts, and categories in the material flows and movements contributing to their and our ongoing formation. So the world we inhabit is a world of material flows, movements, currents, and textures with which we are entangled and therefore cannot be unproblematically removed as an object of body language or bodies languages study. So we're nearly arriving at waves here. I don't know if you can tell. That is why in Being Alive, Tim Ingold's book, he takes his students to the beach to teach them about this. Yes, takes them to the beach in Aberdeen. He wants them to be battered by wind and rain, he says, in order to experience what their textbooks on person-environment relations ignore, what he calls our place in the weather world. Quote, rather than thinking of ourselves only as observers, which is also something that we discussed in this morning's session, the drenched and windswept students of Tim Ingold will experience their surroundings, quote, in the first place as participants, each immersed with the whole of being in the currents of a world in formation. So as Ingold students discover their immersion in one zone of formative and transformative process upon another, the pebbles underfoot, the wheeling forms of seabirds, he says, the mist along the littoral, and he also references the surging breakers on the shore, they also experience themselves not only as being alive, but also becoming, by which Ingold means, quote, awaken to the sense of wonder that comes from riding the crest of the world's continued birth. Surging breakers or waves are also found in the existential reflections on metabolic life by philosopher of biology Hans Jonas, who evokes waves to help distinguish between different perspectives on living forms, which I still haven't understood. In a chapter on the meaning of metabolism, Jonas first evokes a strictly physical material perspective on such dynamic wholes. To illustrate this perspective, he takes a wave, which indeed submits to a mathematical analysis, a bit like the gestures we looked at in the motion capture system. You can examine these waves in terms of their heights, their curl, their pitch, and so on. This physical perspective yields what Jonas would call the, quote, transcending form, event structure, or more generally, the physical world picture, which we might also extend to ways of approaching gesture. He then points out that our waves, quote, particular form of togetherness is an abstraction, an illusion, an incidental result. For as I'm sure that you will know or can remember from school, the visible shape or physical configuration of any given wave at any given moment is of immediate order. Mediate order, meaning its material identity is but, quote, the oscillating units of which it successively consists in its progress. And, you know, there's lots of material to discuss there. For example, I don't know if you can get that picture of the wave. So the wave has some kind of physical identity there that we can see. But actually what the wave is an energy impulse running through the medium that creates the form that we see in the image here, but that is a fleeting form, or what Sheets Johnson might say, a passing moment in a dynamic process. And that one thing that I'm trying to get my head around and understand is how or whether Hans Jonas distinguishes this from the materiality of organic life and other natural phenomena, and how he distinguishes that from physical phenomena, because he makes the point that there is a coincidence between the matter that makes up the wave, those oscillating units, and the materiality of the wave. Whereas I think if I understand what he's saying is that for the organic life has an identity that is distinct from the momentary, from the energies of which it is made up. And that is a distinction between organic life and physical phenomena, in that organic life has a perspective and an identity that does not coincide with the, let's say, the material properties from which it is constituted in its ongoing self-making and self-distinguishing. But as you can see, that's all a little bit jumbled in my mind, but I'm slowly trying to figure that out to understand whether or not we are waves, basically. Because from a perspective of quantum physics, we are waves. Everything in the universe, all particles and atoms are made of waves, including those atoms of which we are made. So how does that relate with Jonas's discussion of the distinction between different forms of life, between organic life and a physical world object view? He says, so I'm still thinking about some of that. And in the last 5 minutes, oh, sorry. So what I would just like to say is that impulse of energy moving through a medium is quite similar to the sense-making dynamic that we looked at. And what is really interesting then is to have a look at surfing, because there you see both the organic form of life and the natural world in this sense-making relation. And you see how the energy running through the wave, the gliding of that energy is what has always been central to the sport or the culture, the cultural activity of surfing. So in the social theory of surfing put forward by Ford and Brown, here I come to the surfer scholars very quickly, the core of surfing has always simply been the embodied, raw, and immediate glide or slide along a wave of energy passing through water. And I'm just going to show this before concluding. So this is Hawaiian waterman, Kai Lenny, and he's riding what's called a hydrofoil. A hydrofoil is basically a surfboard with a upside down plane underneath it. And unlike traditional surfboards, these planes can tap into the energy sources a little easier, as you can see. And so the way he rides his his hydrofoil is to glide across the waves very stylishly, I might add. Of course, this is one of the best surfers in the world. And to tap into the energy sources in the environment, which when the environment is watery, when the media in which the energy is flowing through is water, you can see that energy much more clearly than you can see in the air, although those energies are, of course, in our air as well, as Tim Ingold points out, saying that we often forget about them because we can't see them. But these kind of energy waves are in the air around us as well, emanating from the bodies of other people, emanating from the environments that we're in, and allowing us to surf or ride waves together with each other. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to deprive you from further images of the stylish Kai Lenny, just to put in some final conclusions, or rather tensions. This tension between the gesture unit that we study, or that became a focus in many strands of gesture studies research, which we see as dynamic moments arising from rest, and to juxtapose that with Sheets Johnson's view and the view I've tried to develop for waving of gestures as passing moments within a dynamic process. And then people's bodily relations, do they interact with each other? Well, when we saw the statue unraveling into the social encounter between the daughter and her father at the docks, it's more of an unraveling, or what Tim Ingold would call a corresponding, which is very different to an interacting. And then we tend to discuss these kinds of simple gestures like waving, or a socially recognizable pattern like waving goodbye, saying goodbye, as mundane, but actually I hope to show that they are life-changing on an organic level, like in the sense of sense making, and even life-saving. And I'll just leave you with this thought, that is, what could be less mundane than saying goodbye to someone with a waving gesture? Because when we say goodbye to people, wave goodbye, it is officially the last time we ever see them again, until we see them again. So I better stop there, because I'm not sure whether that last statement is philosophically significant or gibberish. So thank you very much. I would love any questions, comments, or criticisms. I'll open the floor for a Q&A now. Welcome to jump in.
May I make a comment?
Oh, Peter, hi.
Hi, so.
Yeah, please.
Going back to that statuary you showed on the Lancashire coast, Fleetwood Docks.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that the woman holding the baby, it could be ambiguously interpreted. But if you look down at the dog, it's very clear that somebody is coming and not going, because
Wow,
the dog's ears are pricked up and his tail is up. So that sort of implies that dog has less ambiguous attitude towards gesture, or it's simply the artist's choice, of course, because the whole thing is mediated through the artist himself. It's my comment. You don't need to comment on that. I just noticed that.
No, that's brilliant. I had seen the dog, of course, but I hadn't paid any attention to it. That's great.
It's looking expectantly, you know, so it's clearly something is coming towards it. I would see it in that way.
See, that's why I'd really like a dog, because I feel that you've got a sensitivity to these animal-human relations that I just missed completely. Yeah, thanks, Peter. That's great. And thanks for coming.
Oh, no problem. You're welcome.
I have to pay you later.
Oh, well, if nobody else is going to jump in, I've got another comment. You talk about a tension between how do you put it? What's the word? Units. That's right, units and ongoing kinetic dynamic. What's it?
Ongoing kinetic happening would be
right.
Keith Johnson's term. Yeah.
But does one need to be definitive about this? I mean, it reminded me of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You can never be quite sure of a point, a physical point, and the speed of its movement, something along those lines. I can't pretend to fully understand his theory, but surely, are you looking for a definitive understandings of gesture, or is it a, you know, I'm an outsider, I don't know about this subject, or is it a broad church that you can bring in all these peculiar viewpoints?
Yeah, I mean, this is also we can discuss with Silva Ladovic is here, because when I began studying gestures, I got interested in an approach that was really focused on identifying gestures and describing their form properties in terms of, and didn't we, Silva? We had training sessions on how to identify the start and the end of a gesture, and we were very clear about the criteria we had. Like, if you slow the video screen down, then you can see that the gesture kind of ends when the hands stop moving and become a still frame in the video recording. But part of that is because of the software that it's conventional to use in certain strands of gesture research. Like, we have an Elan software that allows you to move frame by frame through the video material and to identify these different moments. And then you can quantify them, and you can say how many of one form of gesture there is and others. So I certainly started with quite a technical approach that I would say is moving towards, that is aiming at a definitive description of gestures. Yeah. But when you take into account the vast array of not only approaches in gesture studies, but approaches to the study of gesture, there are many areas of study of gesture that don't even know what gesture studies or identify with it, but they study gestures, and their concepts are also really useful. Yeah, so I'm all for bringing in as many perspectives as possible. I wonder if Silva would like to comment on that.
Yeah, I would like to. Hello, everybody. I think what we did during these past like 10 or 15 years was really informed by linguistic theory, right? Because linguistics always kind of focused on units, defining units. We wanted to define gesture units, also because we wanted to find out about the precise relationship of gestures and speech. So you can see different temporal relationships, and also you can really precisely define or determine what the gesture does in relation to speech, like on a semantic level, pragmatic level, and so on and so forth. And this, I think, perspective really helped us to get to know more about the medium gesture within this particular theoretical framework. And we also wanted to find out about the motivation of gestures. What forms do they take on? We really wanted to understand the medium gesture, so to say. It's like what Cornelia Müller always says, we wanted to get an idea of what gestures are, like describing an unknown language, right? This is what we did for many, many years. And now I think a lot of us gesture scholars really broaden the scope and really take gestures into, or consider gestures as something that happens in the stream of movements, right? And you look at the stream of movements and the stream of speech and how we move and how we speak, look at larger, you don't want to call it movements, maybe waves or something, Simon, I don't know. Cornelia calls it expressive movement units. You have like holistic gestalts, something like that, that are inspired or that are so to say, determined by the way we move, by the way we speak, and people are really good at determining particular larger movements within a stream of interaction. So this is what we do now, and not many of us, but some of us, and to really kind of get away of this particular focus on the particular beginning of a movement and ending of a movement. Yeah, I don't know if this was clear, but I'm heading in the same direction. You will see that in my talk, and I think it connects to your ideas, Simon, as well. And this is also what you kind of what inspires you when you look at dance, actually, because there are a lot of researchers and philosophers who compare or consider interaction as dance, for instance.
Yeah, the dancing. Yeah, dancing is kind of a spreading. So it's a popular analogy, and actually in the surfing studies that I've been looking at, dancing also comes into play there. Of course, as you saw Kai Lenny gliding across those waves, it's aesthetically pleasing and it resonates with dance, and surfers speak of themselves as dancing across waves.
Yeah.
I just saw.
Yeah, because there's more to it than, because interaction has this idea of like ping pong, right? You have this sequential organization and one sequence kind of informs the other one, and then you react to it and something like that, right? But dance theories are like phenomenological theories that I look at really consider this alignment and this what you call referring to Tim Ingold correspondence, maybe, how bodies align, right? It's not only about the sequential structure of turns, but it's more to that, like affectivity, for instance, or something like that, right? So yeah, that's why I should take a look at Tim Ingold's book that you mentioned.
Yeah, and affectivity is not always something that you can see in the vocalizations and in the gesticulations. It's something that you can feel, something that you can feel from the dynamics of the encounter that's taking place, or that as an analyst you're trying to understand. I think we'll see some of that in your work as well.